Here are words from Thich Nhat Hanh. Remember the words of the Buddha. The past no longer exists, and the future is not here yet. The only moment in which you can be truly alive is at the present moment. The present moment is the destination, the point to arrive at. The address of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas is here and now. That is the address of happiness, the address of life. The Buddha said, life is accessible only in the present moment. Life, with all its wonders, is only accessible right now. We will now move into a few moments of silent meditation. The wisdom story today is from Roger Welsh, a folklore specialist who describes a Native American powwow. I have two pictures to show you partway through the story. I never missed the annual Omaha tribal powwow, always held the weekend before the August full moon. I used the occasion to stuff myself with fry bread and corn soup, talk with friends, listen to good music, and watch stirring dances. My favorite and most uncomfortable moments are when a clown dancer appears in the powwow arena. It doesn't happen every year. You never know when the fellow is going to show up. And that probably says something about him right off the bat. But when he does show up, there is a roar of continuous laughter from all of the Native Americans. The clown dancer bursts on the scene, usually stumbling into the dance arena. Chaos reigns as he stumbles over benches, audience members, lawn chairs, and dancers. His dance is distinctive. His sense of rhythm is horrid, but even worse, he dances counterclockwise, directly against the flow of all the other dancers. This is not only disruptive and clumsy, it's also bad manners. There is no convention or courtesy the clown dancer does not ignore, no taboo he doesn't breach. He finds ways of offending others and embarrassing himself. He does nothing right, nothing. There's no confusing the clown dancer with the other dancers. He is dressed in an ancient, oversized, double-breasted suit. He is wearing a garish necktie, Oxford shoes, and has a briefcase. A white linen flour sack pulled over his head hides his face, and on the sack are painted bright blue eyes and red lips, a startling contrast to the dark skin and eyes of all the other dancers. The clown dancer carries a clock attached to him with a stout rope or chain. As he dances, he refers again and again to his wristwatch and his clock, meanwhile colliding with other dancers, bumping singers at the drum, and stepping on the feet of the visitors. Here's another version of that clown. The message is clear. The clown dancer is the white man.
People of the Western world, particularly Americans, tend to think of time as something fixed in nature, something around us from which we cannot escape, an ever-present part of the environment. That it might be experienced in any other way seems unnatural and strange, a feeling which is rarely modified even when we begin to discover how very differently time is handled by some other people. As a rule, Americans think of time as a road or a ribbon stretching into the future along which one progresses. The road has segments or compartments which are to be kept discreet, one thing at a time. Time with us is handled much like a material. We earn it, we spend it, we save it, we waste it. While we look to the future, our view of it is limited. The future to us is the foreseeable future, not the future of the South Asian that may involve centuries. A colleague once described the Asian conceptualization of time as follows. Time is like a museum with endless corridors and alcoves. You, the viewer, are walking through the museum in the dark, holding a light to each scene as you pass it. God is the curator of the museum, and only He knows all that is in it. One lifetime represents one alcove. Promptness is also valued highly in American life. If people are not prompt, it is often taken either as an insult or as an indication that they are not quite responsible. There are those who would say that we are obsessed with time. They can point to individuals in American culture who are literally time-ridden, and even the rest of us feel very strongly about time because we have been taught to take it so seriously. And an important way we celebrate life each Sunday is by offering an opportunity to practice generosity. Members and friends support our congregation with an annual pledge paid throughout the year. Another way to support the good work of this congregation is by making a generous donation via one of the options shown on this slide. You can click on the tiny URL link in the chat window to donate, or you can send a text to the number shown on the screen. The examples on the slide show how to label your text to indicate the amount and purpose of your gift. The number on the screen is 844-976-26 18. Our offertory music today is by Randy Sparks. It will be presented by Alyssa Yeager.
Do you remember the feeling that I've had recently? You perhaps have had the same experience. I was out in my backyard and I waved at my neighbor who was out in her yard. Since we had not planned to get together, neither one of us had a mask. So we started 6 feet apart. But pretty soon, I got excited about what I was saying, and I moved closer. And she sort of went, oops, and moved back, and I laughed, and I moved back too. And we kept on talking. Pretty soon, she moved closer. And then we both laughed, and we moved back. This is what we call the distance dance. Perhaps you have had that same experience in talking to friends. For Americans, it's most comfortable to be about 4 feet apart. And so it's hard to stay at 6 feet apart. But in many parts of the world, the preference is for 4 feet, or 3 feet, or 2 feet. That's one of the things we'll be talking about today, is this intrinsic sense of how our bodies use space. Just like those birds on the wire who space themselves so nicely and regularly, people have senses of what is the correct space. And then there's time. Time is something which is vivid for all of us. Let's start with an example. Imagine that you're 5 minutes late for a meeting. What do you do when you walk in? You mumble something about sorry. But if you're 10 minutes late, you feel you need more explanation. Too many red lights, a last-minute phone call, something like that. And if you're 15 minutes late for this meeting, you know that the person who's waiting for you will be really offended. But it's not like that in many parts of the world. For example, in southern Germany, the mumble something time is half an hour. This story came from a book called The Silent Language by Edward T. Hall, which was written in 1969 and republished as a second edition in 1973. The book fascinates me because it has all these examples of how people unconsciously use time and space. And these examples that I'll be talking about today are good examples of many of the Unitarian Universalist values. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and the goal of world community. This behavior of using time and space is what Hall calls the silent language, because it's a language that is outside of consciousness. The out-of-awareness aspect of it means that often we have no idea that what is happening. But this silent language affects how the world is perceived, how the self is perceived, and even how life is organized. I find these ideas fascinating because the insight offered by these ideas can give us insight into sometimes our difficulties with other people, but it can also give us insight into our religious strivings. Before I start, I want to have a caveat. When I say we or Americans do this or that, it's possible that what I'm talking about is privileged white Americans, and that this experience of what is the right distance or how the time is organized may be different for Black Americans. It certainly is different for immigrant people who've come and become Americans. But I'll speak about what Hall speaks about in his book. And because I have to skip, I have to keep to my time allotment. Although Hall has examples from all over the world, I'll focus on examples for Native Americans and Middle Easterners. It's like the air we breathe. This is all natural. These expectations about time and space are the way we feel it this is supposed to be. And if we encounter somebody who uses a different set of behaviors, our tendency might be to be angry at them or to ridicule them, just like that clown was ridiculing Americans' obsession with time. So by studying these things, we learn about ourselves and others. Here's a fun example. We think animals are alive and move around, and plants are alive and are stationary. However, in the Trobriand Islands in the South Pacific, people there believe that plants also can move around. Just like the bird comes out and lands on a branch outside your window, plants can be coming to your house. And stop to think about it. How do you know that those weeds that show up in your garden didn't choose to be there? How do you know, come spring, and one of your favorite plants doesn't return, how do you know that that plant didn't just pick up and decide it didn't want to be in your yard anymore? You really don't know that, except you were taught as a child that plants are stationary. If, as a kid in the Trobriand Islands, you were taught that to be a good gardener, your job was to make all the plants happy and stay in your yard, and if you are very, very clever, you can maybe snaggle some plants from somebody else's yard and convince them to come in and join you. That's what you would think, because that's how you were raised. We were raised differently. It's kind of a silly example, but it gives you the notion that things can be radically different. And if they were, that's what you would think. Now, back to time. As John read about our sense of time, Americans tend to think of time as a conveyor belt. It runs along, and on this conveyor belt there are boxes. In these boxes are days, hours, minutes, even seconds. And our job is to fill all those boxes as they go ahead along on the conveyor belt. And if you don't get all the boxes full, you are wasting time. On the other hand, if you get one box and you fill it so much that that overflows and it takes longer than that box, you get antsy because it's taking too much time. You can only think about how you feel if the church service is 15 minutes too long to know that sense of discomfort when the conveyor box is overfilled. But in many parts of the world, these experiences don't happen. Time is not anything that matters. It's not a factor. Things start when they start, and they go along until they're done, and that's that. An example of this was a wedding that my son and his wife went to. The bride and groom were from Colombia. Ray was staying with the groom. The wedding was supposed to start, let's say, at 8 o'clock. At 8 o'clock, the groom was still in his skivvies. He hadn't started to put on his tuxedo. Ray gets all dressed up and goes off to the church, and he and his wife were the only ones there. Around an hour later, in comes the groom, and the bride comes in about an hour and a half later, and the wedding started, and they had partied until dawn. Everybody had a wonderful time. But that's a very different conception of time. In many languages of the world, there are no words for past or future. All the verbs are in the present tense. For us, it would be almost impossible to talk without that. We're having a little microphone adjustment here.
Go ahead.
Okay. In many parts of the world, there are no words for past or future. You'd have to talk using only verbs in the present tense. And in the Middle East, there's no difference between what we would consider a long time and a very long time. They're all the same. Here's another example. We've met a professional friend at a meeting who told us that he was at a meeting in India, and he was ready to come home after the meeting, and he went to the airport. He was told that the airplane would not leave until there were enough passengers to fill the plane. So the airline put him up in a resort hotel for 2 days until enough passengers filtered in to fill the plane, and then he finally got to fly home. Now there's a very different conception of time. In his book, Hall says that for the Arabs, time isn't a road, it's a point. It's just now, and that's all. He says there's no point in making an appointment for anything more than a week in advance, because for these people, 2 weeks in advance occupies the same fuzzy space as 5 years from now does for us. And an appointment is not a commitment. He tells of rescheduling a meeting 11 times. The first 10 times, whoever it was he had the appointment with was doing something else at that moment and didn't show up. Only the present matters. Only the present matters. You heard it somewhere else, in Reverend Sam Trembour's meditation classes. In meditation classes, and for the pagans who have tried to adopt Native American spirituality, time is like breathing. It is only now. In the Sioux language, for example, there's no word for late. Wouldn't it be wonderful to not have a word for late? There's also no word for waiting. So I guess they don't get impatient while they're waiting. They don't have a word for it. To experience time in this way, as a luminous sacred point, is to enter the mystical realm of spirit. Time is like breathing. It's just there, always there, but it doesn't have any more meaning than breathing in and breathing out. However, Reverend Sam is still a captive of American time. He cannot say, this meditation is going really, really well. We'll let it go for an hour and a half, and we'll just start our service a half an hour later. That might be okay in the rest of the world. It's an interesting thing to think about, and I see Reverend Sam likes the idea. Now, on to space. We've already talked about having an unspoken sense about how close to get to somebody in order to be comfortable. For the Arabs, it's much more likely to be comfortable if they're much closer. We have a Lebanese friend named Tom who routinely backs people into a wall because he gets closer to them and they back away. He gets closer to them and they back away. He gets closer to them and they back away. Many Arabs think, we would say, that he is a very pushy man. But many Arabs would say, we are really cold, always trying to be so far from people. This is a good example of how the unspoken sense of space is there as a language. Territoriality is another aspect of space that we don't articulate. We have our house, our car, our yard, our church. All of these things are part of our space. If somebody else invades them, we get really upset. At least we get annoyed. The things which make person A comfortable could possibly raise discomfort in person B. When we say somebody is pushy, we're just saying they handle space differently than we do. When that happens, it's important to understand what happened and analyze it. Not to feel guilty about it, but just to figure out what did go on. So the next time you see that person, you can interact with them in a more genuine and comfortable way. Edward Hall says in his book, sometimes it's more important to overcome a spatial accent than to overcome a language accent. Here's another example. In the Middle East, a powerful man will have a meeting. A potentate will be in a room with lots of chairs, a big room with lots of chairs. People who want to see this powerful man will come and sit in a chair and wait their turn. They'll spend maybe the whole day there, chatting with each other, gossiping, picking up the lay of the land. What's the guy saying to them? So you'll have some sense of what to do when you talk to him. They're all in this one big room. And eventually you have your turn and you talk to him. That's so different from our pattern of thinking. If you've got an appointment, you're alone in a room with somebody. But for those people, to be alone in the room with a powerful man would be terrifying. I wonder if our politicians, ambassadors, and other international people are trained in the ideas from the silent language and other similar authors. I certainly hope so. But I'm also pretty sure that our politicians do not have this idea and very often think that everybody else should just do it our way. Can you imagine President Trump sitting in a big room full of people for a day waiting his turn to talk to the powerful potentate? I don't think so. I think I've given you enough examples now to know that our patterns are our familiar and comfortable patterns, that it's not necessarily the only way. So as you go through your week this week, look for those kinds of patterns. Pay attention to what you read in the papers. Pay attention to how you respond to things. If you choose to read the book White Fragility and other similar books about anti-racism, pay attention to what they might say about how African Americans and other blacks experience time and space. Where do they accept our dominant paradigm? Where do they rebel against it? There'll be some interesting learning there. And then pay attention to your own sense of time and space. Working from home, you're somewhat relieved from the conveyor belt of hours going on, and you may not have to use your minute minder to keep track of everything as you might in your office. How do you feel about that? Are you freed, or does it make you a little bit anxious? Stay working home with the kids, you know that they have much less sense of time. How do you feel about that? Do you joy in their freedom, or does that make you angry and annoyed? When you are with your friends, pay attention to those distance dances. How do you respond? These are challenging and difficult times. I hope that these insights into unconscious connections to time and space will bring a fresh perspective to help you through these days.
As we extinguish the chalice, please join in the words that will appear on the screen. As we We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
In these languid summer days, step off the conveyor belt of time. Be still. Observe a bird or a flower. Sniff the fragrant July air. Feel the cool of the shade and the warmth of the sun. Listen for the joyous sound of children at play. With a friend, get out a tape measure and stand exactly 6 feet apart. Experience emotional closeness no matter how far apart you are. In these languid summer days, be at home with yourself. Go in peace, make peace, be at peace.
We offer our thanks this morning to the ushers, Dawn Dana, Dick Dana, Chuck Manning, and Jean Poppy. Our pastoral care associate is Donna Meixner. The welcomer for the morning has been Barb Manning. We have office support. The person who put the whole thing together was Sapphire Correa. And our technical support this morning has been from Chris Jensen. Thank you all very much. I have received no announcements for the morning.